Good evening. It's Wednesday, September 9th. Famed reporter Bob Woodward has it on tape. President Trump admitting in a February 7th interview that he knew the coronavirus outbreak posed a mortal threat in the United States, while he was telling the American public it was no big deal.
It goes through air, Bob. That's always tougher than the touch. You know, the touch, you don't have to touch things, right? But the air, you just breathe the air. That's how it's passed. And so that's a very tricky one. That's a very delicate one. It's also more deadly than your strenuous flus.
Trump says he wasn't telling America the truth in order to keep people from panicking. Democratic presidential candidate Joe Biden, campaigning in Michigan, blasts Trump's record of double dealing on the pandemic. The head of the National Institutes of Health tells Congress that U.S. health officials will not skip or abbreviate any safety assessments in the development of a coronavirus vaccine.
Please hear me now. The rigor of the scientific evaluation of safety and efficacy will not be compromised.
Meanwhile, the pharmaceutical company AstraZeneca announces that it's pausing its late-stage trial after a suspected serious adverse reaction in one trial volunteer in the United Kingdom. And a Northern California wildfire that had been smoldering for weeks roars to life after being stoked by high winds and burns a 25-mile path through mountainous terrain and parched foothills. The fire scorches an unprecedented 400 square miles in a single day, one of 24 fires burning in California that have forced evacuations around the state and have choked the air with thick smoke and cast an eerie orange hue across Northern California. From Pacifica Radio, KPFA in Berkeley, KPFK in Los Angeles, this is the Evening News. I'm Mark Miracle. President Donald Trump talked privately about the severity of the coronavirus threat, even as he was telling the nation the virus was no worse than the seasonal flu, and insisting the government had it totally under control. That's according to a new book by journalist Bob Woodward. You just breathe the air, and that's how it's passed, Trump said in a February 7th call with Woodward. And so that's a very tricky one. That's a very delicate one. It's also more deadly than even your strenuous flus. This is deadly stuff, the president repeated for emphasis. His comments were recorded by Woodward, and audio has been released.
It goes through air, Bob. That's always tougher than the touch. You know, the touch, you don't have to touch things, right? But the air, you just breathe the air. That's how it's passed. And so that's a very tricky one. That's a very delicate one. It's also more deadly than your strenuous flus. You know, people don't realize we lose 25,000, 30,000 people a year here. Who would ever think that, right?
I know. It's
pretty amazing. And then I say, well, is that the same thing? This is more deadly. This is 5 per. You know, this is 5% versus 1% and less than 1%. You know, so this is deadly stuff.
The Washington Post, where Woodward serves as associate editor, reported excerpts of the book Rage today, as did CNN. The book also covers race relations, diplomacy with North Korea, and a range of other issues that have arisen during the past 2 years. The book is based in part on 18 interviews that Woodward conducted with Trump between December and July. White House Press Secretary Kayleigh McEnany said the president's false assurance to the public about the coronavirus were designed to express confidence and calm at a time of major challenges. She insisted that Trump has never lied to the American people about COVID. At times, Trump's public comments suggested he was less interested in keeping people calm than in having them ignore the reality of the coming storm. I think the virus it's going to be fine, Trump said on February 10th. That was just 3 days after telling Woodward privately it was deadly stuff and more dangerous than the seasonal flu. Trump's aides and allies said at the time Trump was aiming to prop up the economy with his rosy take on the virus throughout February, as his administration took few concrete steps to prepare for the coming pandemic. At the White House today, a reporter asked Trump about lying to the American people about the virus's threat, or downplaying, as he put it, the danger.
I don't want people to be frightened. I don't want to create panic, as you say. And certainly I'm not going to drive this country or the world into a frenzy. We want to show confidence. We want to show strength. We want to show strength as a nation. And that's what I've done. And we've done very well. We've done well from any standard. You look at our numbers compared to other countries, other parts of the world. It's been an amazing job that we've done.
Press Secretary McEnany said the president never downplayed the virus, but Trump himself told Woodward that he was, quote, playing it down because I don't want to create a panic. Woodward, however, himself came under criticism for only now revealing Trump's early understanding about the severity of the coronavirus, while all the while misleading the American public. Woodward told the Associated Press that he needed time to be sure that Trump's private comments from February were accurate. On Twitter and elsewhere online, commentators accused Woodward of valuing book sales over public health. Joe Biden traveled to suburban Detroit today to make a direct appeal to blue-collar workers who might have voted Republican 4 years ago but now regret it, attempting to rebuild the once fabled Democratic blue wall that crumbled and helped catapult Donald Trump to the White House 4 years ago. The former vice president's first coronavirus-era campaign trips beyond his home in Delaware have been to Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, an indication of how closely Biden's electoral prospects are tied to winning back those formerly reliable Democratic states. Although the Biden campaign often emphasizes that it sees multiple ways to secure the 270 electoral college votes it needs to win in November, the quickest path runs through Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. Biden today pledged to rewrite tax codes to reward U.S. companies that invest in domestic manufacturing while imposing penalties on those that send jobs to other countries. He spoke outside a United Autoworkers regional office in Warren, flanked by an array of U.S.-made cars, including Fords, Jeeps, and Chevrolets. Biden blasted Trump over the revelations that he downplayed the coronavirus threat as early as January. Biden also promised that if he's elected, he would be the most union-friendly president in history. Christopher Martinez reports.
Former Vice President Joe Biden took his presidential campaign to Michigan Wednesday, where he made a pitch to blue-collar workers in the battleground state that Trump carried by the narrowest of margins back in the 2016 presidential election. In contrast to President Donald Trump's campaign appearances, Biden made a point of following public health guidelines at his event.
As I'm socially distanced, I'm allowed to take my mask off, they tell me, while I speak, but I promise I'll put it back on, Gov.
After praising unions and recalling his own ties to the auto industry, his father ran a General Motors agency and Biden still owns a 1967 Corvette, Biden wasted no time in jumping on the latest bombshell revelations from Washington Post journalist Bob Woodward. Biden says on the day the U.S. hit the total of 190,000 Americans dead from COVID-19, Washington Post journalist Bob Woodward's bombshell revelations came out, alleging that Trump knew but downplayed the threat of a pandemic as early as February.
He knew how deadly it was. It was much more deadly than the flu. He knew and purposely played it down. Worse, he lied to the American people. He knowingly and willingly lied about the threat it posed to the country for months. He had the information. He knew how dangerous it was. And while this deadly disease ripped through our nation, he failed to do his job on purpose. It was a life and death betrayal of the American people. Experts say that if he had acted just 1 week sooner, 36,000 people would have been saved. If he acted 2 weeks sooner, back in March, 54,000 lives would have been spared in March and April alone.
Biden says Trump's intentional failure not only cost lives, but also sent the economy into a tailspin and left schools and families struggling.
This is a recession created by Donald Trump's negligence, and he is unfit for this job as a consequence of it. How many schools aren't open right now? How many kids are starting the new school year the same way they ended the last one, at home? How many parents feel abandoned and overwhelmed? How many frontline workers are exhausted and pushed to their limits? And how many families are missing loved ones at their dinner table tonight because of his failures? It's beyond despicable. It's a dereliction of duty. It's a disgrace.
Biden also blasted Trump for alleged remarks referring to U.S. war dead as losers and suckers.
No one who served this nation has been a loser or a sucker. They're all heroes. But would you expect anything different from someone who could stand next to a father of a fallen soldier and say, at a cemetery, and say, I don't get it. What was in it for them? What was in it for them? Donald Trump doesn't understand what it means to serve something bigger than yourself. He doesn't understand duty, honor, country. He lives in by a different code. Lies, selfishness, greed. Yes, Donald Trump and I have a pretty different philosophy when it comes to giving our word. Mine means something.
Biden's event in Warren, Michigan marks his effort to win back a formerly blue state that narrowly went to Trump in the 2016 election. Biden says in July he made the first plank of his agenda a plan to modernize American manufacturing and technology in order to make sure the future is made in America. Now he's adding details. He's vowing to close what he calls loopholes in Trump's 2017 tax cut in order to stop the flight of manufacturing companies overseas.
Today, I'm announcing my new American Made in America tax credit, a 10% advanceable tax credit for companies that invest in the United States and American workers to help accelerate the recovery under our Build Back Better agenda. So if your company revitalizes a closing facility here in the United States, like the transmission plant that got closed last year, we'll take care of 10% of the investment that company makes to reopen it.
Biden is also promising to create a Made in America office in the White House. It's a message tailor-made to attract blue-collar voters in the Midwest swing states.
You're going to have the best, most friendly union president in the history of the United States of America when I'm in the White House.
Biden's speech took place outside a United Auto Workers office in the Detroit suburb of Warren, Michigan. Last week, Biden was in Wisconsin, followed by a Labor Day event in Pennsylvania. Those three states are seen as must-win states for Trump, and a Biden victory in one or two of those states would help block Trump's path to an electoral college victory in November. So Biden is likely to keep up the pressure with the kind of labor-friendly pitch he made to Michigan workers.
I don't buy for 1 second that the vitality of American manufacturing is a thing of the past. We have the most qualified workers in the world. American manufacturing is the old expression you heard your grandpop say and grandmother, was the arsenal of democracy in World War II. Well, guess what? It's going to be part of the engine of American prosperity now in 2021. And we're going to make it happen with American grit, American determination, and American union workers.
Reporting for Pacifica Radio News KPFA, I'm Christopher Martinez.
And you are listening to the evening news on KPFA Berkeley, KPFK Los Angeles, KFCF Fresno, online at kpfa.org. President Donald Trump is planning to travel to Nevada this weekend, though large airport rallies initially set for Las Vegas and Reno appear to have been scuttled after local officials warned they would violate Nevada's coronavirus-related ban on gatherings of more than 50 people. Trump campaign spokesman Tim Murtaugh said Trump would still be traveling to Nevada and accused Democrats of trying to keep Trump from speaking to voters because they know the enthusiasm behind his reelection campaign cannot be matched by Joe Biden. Nevada Governor Steve Sisolak, a Democrat, has limited in-person gatherings indoors and outdoors to 50 people since May, a recommendation based on White House reopening guidelines. Earlier today, the Reno Tahoe Airport Authority warned a company that planned to host the campaign rally for 5,000 people at a private hangar that it would be in violation of the governor's restrictions and the terms of the company's lease for the hangar. Meanwhile, a spokeswoman for North Carolina's governor says Trump's rally in Winston-Salem this week violated state health and safety protocols, but was not illegal. Thousands of supporters who attended Tuesday's rally were seen crammed together without masks or the 6 feet of physical distancing that the White House itself has recommended. Democratic Governor Roy Cooper has limited mass gatherings to 50 people outdoors. Cooper spokeswoman Dory McMillan says there is an exception for First Amendment activities, including political rallies. But in a written statement, she also admonished the Trump campaign for putting people's health at risk by ignoring the rules. An Iowa judge who nullified 50,000 absentee ballot requests in Iowa's second-largest county seems poised to void thousands more in a neighboring county at the urging of President Trump's reelection campaign. Judge Ian Thornhill heard arguments today in Johnson County, the state's most Democratic-leaning, in a similar lawsuit brought by Trump's campaign and Republican Party groups. He said he would issue a ruling soon, but raised several points that he did in his Lynn County ruling last month that gave Trump a sweeping legal victory. Trump's campaign argues that county elections commissioners in Johnson, Lynn, and Woodbury acted improperly when they mailed absentee ballot request forms to voters with their personal information already filled in. With the election season in full swing, media watchdog groups are warning the public to be on the alert for a flood of misinformation on social media platforms. Public News Service reporter Mark Richardson reports on the tools that the public could use to be on the lookout.
So how can you tell if it's accurate information, misinformation, or just plain fake? Christy Roschke, a media literacy professor at Arizona State University, says it helps to view what you see with a healthy dose of skepticism.
There are bad actors doing their level best to flood those information systems with false information. There are people who are wishing to skew narratives one way or the other. And then there are just a lot of confused people who are awash in all of this, trying to make sense of it all.
Roschke says the Constitution guarantees a free press and prevents the government from controlling what is published. She warns that disinformation, inaccuracy that is spread deliberately, especially about politics, isn't just a harmless prank. It can damage democratic institutions. She says while disinformation can come from an organized political group, a reputable-sounding news site, or forwarded by your favorite uncle, voters need to trust their own instincts when a story doesn't sound quite right.
Is anybody else reporting this? You see a picture of something that seems particularly egregious and you think, how could that be true? If you Google it and it doesn't appear anywhere else, chances are it's probably not.
Roschke says a big part of the problem stems from the country's deep political divide.
When you read stuff that maybe doesn't follow along the same lines on the political spectrum, you can see the pieces that are the same in a left-leaning story and a right-leaning story. That's where you can kind of get at what some of these actual facts we can verify are.
Roschke, who also manages ASU's News Collaboration Project, says they offer a free online course on how to be an educated news consumer. Find it at mediaactive.newscollab.org. Support for this reporting was provided by the Carnegie Corporation of New York. For Public News Service, I'm Mark Richardson.
An official at the Department of Homeland Security says he was pressured by agency leaders to make his intelligence reports reflect the priorities of the Trump administration. Brian Murphy also says in a whistleblower complaint that he was demoted from his position as the Office of Intelligence and Analysis in retaliation for refusing to alter his reports on such matters as Russian interference in the election and the extent of the threat posed by white supremacists. A copy of the complaint was released today by Congressman Adam Schiff of Los Angeles of the House Intelligence Committee. Schiff says he's asked Murphy to testify to Congress. A massive cloud of smoke covered much of northern and central California today, dimming the sun to an eerie orange glow over the San Francisco Bay Area. About 125 miles to the northeast, winds fanned a huge fire in the Sierra Nevada foothills, forcing authorities to order early morning evacuations and to warn other residents to be ready to leave. The area is not far from the town of Paradise, where 85 people were killed by a fire 2 years ago, and the Oroville Dam, where a failing spillways forced a massive evacuation in 2017. Some of the smoke is from there. More of it is from fires as far away as Oregon. The so-called Bear Fire had been smoldering for weeks. It roared to life after being stoked by high winds and burned a 25-mile path through mountainous terrain and parched foothills. A climate scientist said today that the fire's rapid spread was unprecedented. Daniel Swain at the University of California, Los Angeles, said the fire burned an estimated 400 square miles in a day. It's one of 24 fires burning in California that have forced evacuations and have choked the air in northern and central California. Firefighters in central California continue to battle the Creek Fire, which continues to rage out of control. That fire has scorched more than 152,000 acres, destroying more than 350 structures. And the Creek Fire has forced KPFA's sister station, KFCF in Fresno, off the air. Airborne tankers dumped water and fire retardant on KFCF's transmitter building at Meadow this afternoon. The station is trying to get back on the air. It secured a site at Bear Mountain near Dunlap, and a new antenna, mast, and transmitter are to be delivered tomorrow. Scott Stevens, a fire ecologist and professor of fire science at UC Berkeley, told KPFA Upfront host Brian Edwards-Teekert that fires like the Creek Fire in the Sierra National Forest that seemed to explode out of nowhere overnight have been years in the making, especially by the long drought in California.
Over 150 million trees died because of the drought and bark beetles. I would say also, though, that the forest was predisposed to that event because they have way too many trees per acre. And when you have a system like that and you go into a drought, then all the trees are trying to get water, and they're going to compete, and bark beetles are going to basically be much more effective. But it killed those trees. And I know when we see those trees standing, it gets our eye, like, oh my goodness, look at that. There's all these dead standing trees with kind of a maybe gray or kind of orange needles. But from a fire behavior standpoint, they're actually much worse when they finally start to fall down because of rot and wind and things of that nature. Because once they get on the ground, they're actually much more available to burn. So it's actually much worse, I would say now, in terms of a fuel bed than right after the drought. 5-10 years or so, you're going to start to see a lot of those big trees come down and actually be part of the fuel bed, and that contributes to what we see in the Creek Fire.
You said too many trees per acre. Why? Because of logging and second growth, or because of fire suppression?
It really was both. We actually found a really interesting data set not too far away from the Creek Fire, a place called the Greenhorn Mountains. It was sampled around 1911. It covered around 40,000 acres of forest before any harvesting or really any fire suppression whatsoever. You look at that data, and it shows big trees, but it shows densities in the range of 40, 50, 60, 80 trees per acre. So very open forest, pine dominated largely with some other species. And you go down there today, and we've done it, you see tree densities maybe 300, 350 trees per acre. And it comes from both the harvesting that occurred, opened up space, took the big trees, left open space, trees basically get established. And then you take fire out. You take fire out for 110 years. Fire used to burn down there every 7 to 10 years. I mean, it was so common. And with that much fire down there, you would thin the forest, keep those densities low, keep the fuels low, just like we measured in 1911. And you put those two things together with a drought, then all of a sudden you have real mortality.
So you're describing circumstances under which the fire burns much more intensely because there's more fuel. Well, is it a problem to have a more intense fire, or is this a just overdue burn finally catching up with us?
No, that's a good question. All of our forests, even back in 1910, 1800, when indigenous people managed them and also lightning, they all had patches of high severity fire. And in fact, patches of high severity fire are integral to the forest ecosystem. It creates openings for early cereal plants that like a lot of sunlight, creates diversity and habitat for wildlife. So it's always been important. But the problem is nowadays, instead of having an opening created by a fire, 5 acres, 10 acres, maybe 100 acres, and a lot of them a lot smaller, 1 acre, 2 acre. The fire now, like the one in the creek, they're creating mortality patches where you kill 90% or 95% of the trees or more over thousands and thousands of acres. So the scale of the patch is the key, because what happens is you don't have enough remaining live trees around that patch to actually successfully regenerate it from their cones. The cones are basically killed by the fire, the seeds inside the cones, and that subsequently causes real problems with sustainability of forest ecosystems. So having some patches of high severity fire is actually important, but they need to be on the small end, 5 acres, 2 acres, 3 acres, 1, instead of maybe 1,000 acres or 2, 3, 4,000, which is completely outside what they can deal with.
So if you have the kind of large sterilizing fire that you just described, what happens to the landscape in the years after the fire? What's the ecosystem that succeeds the forest that was there?
Well, one thing is there and it's native is the shrubs. The shrubs actually have an ability to generate seed. That seed goes into the soil. We call it a soil seed bank. And those seeds can remain viable for 50, 70, 80 years. So even this fire will not kill all those seeds. Some of those seeds then will germinate in the spring, and native shrubs will start to come in really in earnest. And of course, that's not a bad thing. Grasses will come in too. Most of those are non-native grasses nowadays because it's very few native grasses left in California after the mission period. But the shrubs will come back. And then the question is, how do the forests get back? How does the trees get back? Well, they could come back slowly after, succession or changes in vegetation over time. It might be 100 years. Another problem is, though, if you get continuous shrub patches, they actually burn again very intensely, so they can almost keep themselves on the landscape because, again, the seed bank in the soil generate more shrubs, the trees are gone. So having really large patches of shrubs, thousands of acres, makes it very difficult to actually conserve a forest ecosystem.
So I'm curious, what the conversation is in your circles about what to do about this.
It is a conundrum, and to the credit of the Sierra and the Sequoia National Forest, they've been actually working on this with their land management plan revisions, trying to think about how to move that forest to a system that's actually more resilient. The plans actually talk about using fire much more proactively, both prescribed burning, where we put fires on the ground and measure objectives. Usually those are generally small, a few hundred acres, maybe 1,000. But they also, in more remote areas, they actually want lightning fires in remote areas, in some cases, to burn unabated with careful monitoring. Maybe that sounds like a crazy idea, what's going on right now. But, a lightning fire in these conditions would actually have been suppressed. The forest would make an evaluation and say, no, this is bad. We've got bad weather, bad fuel. But if we get a lightning ignition, say in September, or at maybe at 8,000 feet, way up in the mountains where we have few people, maybe we'll allow that one to burn. And the other thing you can do is mechanical methods, the restoration thinning ideas, where you can use machines to basically go in there, take out some of the smaller trees, keep the big ones, generate some patchiness in the forest landscape, a little like that fire behavior we talked about that once existed, some patches an acre or 2, 3, 4. So you can use either mechanical systems, restoration thinning, sometimes combined with prescribed fire or fire. And I'm afraid if we don't start to do that at scale and do that really significantly, we'll never get ahead of this. It really is a conundrum because unless we do that, the way these forests are going to be managed, quote unquote, is going to be by wildfires of this type.
Scott Stevens is professor of fire science at UC Berkeley. More from reporter Christina Onestad.
Fires in California have scorched 2.5 million acres, breaking all records for the most land mass burned in California history since record-keeping began. 14,000 firefighters are battling hundreds of fires across the state that have destroyed tens of thousands of homes and caused smoky skies to turn apocalyptic reddish-orange. Data from the National Weather Service shows this smoke throughout most of the state, all along the coast into Oregon and Seattle, Washington. Weather experts say winds from the Pacific Ocean are expected to push the smoke across the west, worsening air quality as it moves through the region. But it's not as bad as it could be, says Braden Murdoch, a meteorologist with the National Weather Service. He says a marine layer from the coast is keeping the Bay Area cool as the smoke hangs above it.
Most of our smoke is sitting about at an altitude of about 2,000 feet to 6,000 feet up. And what that's doing is it's filtering out a lot of light. And the only thing that's really getting through is the red and orange light. And that's why everything looks very orange out there. And at the surface, we're actually not seeing a whole lot of that smoke falling. Along with it, we have seen the marine layer hold pretty strong today, and since we haven't seen a whole lot of sunlight, that marine layer didn't really get a chance to mix out. So that's why we haven't seen a whole lot of that smoke come to the surface. We're seeing fairly cool conditions. A lot of our smoke's just staying too high up to really affect most folk.
A Spare the Air alert is in effect throughout the Bay Area until Friday, September 11th, making it the longest consecutive Spare the Air alert for the Bay in recorded history. 25 days by Friday. Despite the apocalyptic skies, officials say air quality is moderate. That's below federal levels for unhealthy air. Aaron Richardson, a spokesperson for the Bay Area Air Quality Management District.
The smoke looks terrible, but it hasn't really drifted down and mixed as much as we feared that it might and impacted people at ground level. So we've had mostly moderate air quality in the Bay Area, with a few sort of around the perimeter. There have been a few spots where there's been some unhealthy for sensitive groups, orange air quality. For most people, moderate air quality will not have major impacts. It's below the federal health standard, and it's only when it shades up into the orange unhealthy for sensitive groups category or above that you start being, the general population would start being concerned.
Air quality in Fresno is at an unhealthy level, though, meaning people with heart or lung disease, older adults, children, and teens should stay indoors. All others should limit outdoor air exposure. To the north, a new fire in Oroville overnight has forced evacuations of 20,000 people and put the entire town under an evacuation warning. The Bear Fire exploded in Plumas County and into Butte County. It burned slowly in Plumas County after igniting from lightning strikes 3 weeks ago. But overnight, fierce winds fanned the flames, and it exploded, spanning 25 miles at an unprecedented speed into Butte County, near the town of Paradise, which was devastated by fire that leveled the town 2 years ago. That fire has spread to nearly 70,000 acres and is now 58% contained. There's been one injury, 14 structures destroyed, including homes and businesses, and one structure damaged. The National Forest Service, meanwhile, has closed all the national forests in the state of California due to the unprecedented rate of fires. But California isn't alone in an unprecedented fire year. In Washington state, more acres burned in a single day than firefighters usually see all year. Fires have also forced people to flee in Oregon and Idaho. As for smoky apocalyptic skies, the National Weather Service says it's likely to stay reddish-orange for the coming days. I'm Christina Onestad, reporting for KPFA.
And you're listening to the Evening News on KPFA in Berkeley, KPFK in Los Angeles, KFCF Fresno, online, KPFA.org. It's an hour-long newscast. There's each night at 6. There's a half-hour edition on the weekends. I'm Mark Miracle. 6 young people in Portugal are taking the worst of Europe's fossil fuel emitters to Europe's Human Rights Court for failing to act quickly enough to get their emissions in line with the targets set out by the Paris Agreement on climate change. This comes 3 years after a series of wildfires devastated Portugal, killing over 120 people. KPFA's Chris Lee filed this report.
In 2017, climate-induced megafires ravaged Portugal and burned an area roughly the size of the state of Delaware, killing over 120 people. Claudia Agostinho is a 21-year-old nursing student in Portugal and one of 6 plaintiffs in the first climate change lawsuit filed with the ECHR, European Court of Human Rights, against 33 of 47 member states of the Council of Europe. Agostinho says she witnessed the Leiria region where she grew up destroyed by the deadly forest fires that engulfed Portugal in 2017.
Em 2017, assisti com horror aos incêndios florestais mortíferos.
In 2017, I witnessed in horror the deadly forest fires that destroyed several areas of the country, including the region of Leiria. It was overwhelming for me to see how the forests where I usually like to be suddenly became extremely dangerous places. In that moment, I clearly understood that climate change is making the world an increasingly dangerous place, and that my generation is increasingly vulnerable and without future prospects.
Cada vez mais perigoso.
Agostinho calls climate change a public health crisis that will increasingly kill more people. The lawsuit filed on behalf of Agostinho and 5 other young people in Portugal, aged 8 to 21, cites scientific data published by Climate Action Tracker. That data indicates most of Europe is currently on track to reach or increase to 4 degrees Celsius, well beyond the 1.5-degree threshold set by the 2016 Paris Agreement. Gary Liston is a legal officer for the Global Climate Action Network, which is backing the plaintiffs. Liston says this lawsuit, depending on how it's ruled, could buttress existing commitments made by the Paris Agreement.
They are facing the very real possibility of living to see a 4-degree warmer world. And in Portugal, that's a world where extreme heat waves with temperatures of over 40 degrees Celsius could endure for over 30 days at a time, where the number of days that there's an extreme risk of forest fires quadruples in some parts of the country, rising to up to 80 or 90 days per year.
This is the second time Europe has been indicted on human rights grounds for failing to address climate change. Last fall, youth climate activist Greta Thunberg and 15 other children filed a legal complaint with the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child. That lawsuit also cites data published by Climate Action Tracker and alleges similar human rights violations. Mark Willers, co-counsel for the 6 Portuguese youths, says the accused nations are in violation of Articles 2, 8, and 14 of the European Convention on Human Rights.
Put bluntly, climate change affects the applicant's right to life because it increases their chances of dying prematurely. Climate change also affects their right to respect for their privacy and their family lives. It's a right which covers both their physical and mental well-being. Finally, we're arguing that the European states are unlawfully discriminating against these children and young adults by failing to properly tackle the climate crisis.
According to Willers, the lawsuit faces one large obstacle. He says there is a chance it could be rejected outright by the ECHR because the plaintiffs haven't yet exhausted all domestic remedies, meaning the case would have to be taken to the highest court in all 33 countries before going to Europe's highest human rights court. If the lawsuit survives, he says it could take months or even years before it gets a fair hearing. In 2015, a similar climate change lawsuit was brought by youths against the Obama administration, alleging the United States ignored climate change for decades and violated their constitutional rights. However, that case, Juliana versus United States, was thrown out in January by a federal appeals court, effectively ruling that the judicial branch has no constitutional power to order the federal government to draw down fossil fuel emissions. I'm Chris Lee reporting for KPFA.
According to a new United Nations report, the world is getting closer to exceeding a temperature limit set by global leaders 5 years ago. In the next 5 years, the world has a nearly 1 in 4 chance of experiencing a year that's hot enough to put the global temperature at 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit, 1.5 degrees Celsius, above pre-industrial times. That's according to a new science update released today by the UN World Meteorological Organization and other global science groups. The 1.5 degrees Celsius is the more stringent of two limits set in 2015 by world leaders in the Paris Climate Change Agreement. A 2018 UN science report said a world hotter than that still survives, but chances of dangerous problems increase tremendously. Top police officials in Rochester, New York have announced their retirement amid nightly protests over the in-custody suffocation death of Daniel Prude. His family has filed a federal lawsuit alleging a cover-up by law enforcement. Police Chief LaRon Singletary, Deputy Chief Joseph Morbido, and 2 commanders retired, while 2 more deputy chiefs and a commander gave up their top leadership positions and returned to lower ranks. Chief Singletary said his critics were trying to destroy his character. Sarah Walton reports.
Rochester Police Chief LaRon Singletary said he was standing down as he could not watch his handling of Mr. Prude's death being distorted. A grand jury has been set up to determine if any charges should be brought in the case. 7 police officers involved in the arrest were suspended after footage of it was released last week, prompting protests in the city of Rochester. I'm Sarah Walton in New York.
Rochester Mayor Lovely Warren told reporters the city is working on reforming its police department.
I will be meeting with City Council to chart a path forward. I can assure this community that I am committed to instituting the reforms necessary in our police department.
The resignations came more than 5 months after the death of Prude, a 41-year-old African-American man who died several days after an encounter with police on March 23rd. Video of the encounter has sparked outrage. There have been nightly protests in Rochester since the video's release a week ago. A coalition of 7 major cities, including Oakland, Portland, Seattle, and New York, are demanding records from the Trump administration about deployments of federal agents to progressively led U.S. cities. Supported by the Public Rights Project, they filed a Freedom of Information Act today asking for records created after the police killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis, all related to the president's executive order that allows the Attorney General and the Secretary of Homeland Security to send federal personnel into the cities to protect federal property. According to a press release from the city of Oakland, the Trump administration has escalated its confrontations with these cities ahead of the November 3rd, 2020 election. Its most recent provocation includes issuing a presidential memorandum that claims to block federal funding to so-called anarchist cities, including New York, Seattle, and Portland. Oakland says there's also significant public interest in learning whether deployments and tactics similar to those used in Portland are being or may be used in connection with the November presidential election. Public Rights Project legal director Jonathan Miller says the Trump administration's deployment of federal agents into the cities is designed to stoke fears, incite violence, and create upheaval. He claims the intention is not to restore order. He calls it a purely political tactic, directly harming communities by driving a wedge between law enforcement and community activists who are working to push needed reforms for racial justice at the local and state levels. In Ontario, Canada, a First Nation community marked a solemn anniversary over the past weekend. A quarter of a century since the Ipperwash crisis claimed the life of a Native activist. Dan Karpenchuk reports.
The crisis began on the Labor Day weekend of 1995. Members of the Chippewas, Kettle, and Stony Point First Nation occupied the Ipperwash Provincial Park. They were protesting against a seizure of reserve land by the Canadian government during the Second World War for a military base. That land was supposed to be returned after the war, but by 1990 it still had not been. They say the land included a sacred burial ground. So, for 2 days, protesters and police faced off, and during a confrontation, police opened fire on a group of protesters, killing Dudley George. Chief Jason Henry was 15 years old at the time and remembers his own encounter with a police officer.
He stepped out and he had an automatic rifle. He pointed at me and said, "You're nothing but a worthless wagon burner. I should just pull the trigger."
First Nations chiefs want the Ontario government to reflect on the relationship with Native people on the 25th anniversary of Ipperwash. They say distrust still exists between their people and the authorities as a result of unaddressed inequalities. An inquiry into the deadly crisis highlighted concerns about how police handled the response. The judge found that the then Premier of Ontario, Mike Harris, and the federal government were responsible for George's death. In the latest development, the First Nation, at the end of August, was given new land, more than 110 acres, that was once part of Ipperwash Provincial Park. For National Native News, I'm Dan Karpinchuk.
And you're listening to the evening news on KPFA Berkeley, KPFK Los Angeles, KFCF Fresno, online at kpfa.org.
Hey everyone, this is Brian Edwards-Teekert.
And I'm Kat Brooks.
Weekday mornings, we host Upfront.
2 hours of conversation about what's in the news and what should be.
Politics, technology.
Prisons, police.
What's happening in City Hall and at the State House.
In Washington and in the streets.
That's starting at 7 a.m., right after Democracy Now!
On Upfront.
The Trump administration is defying a Supreme Court ruling that DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, is constitutional and therefore should continue in its operations. Lily Bolke has the story.
Almost 24,000 undocumented young Arizonans rely on the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, or DACA, to live and work in the state. In July, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the Trump administration's attempt to repeal DACA was unconstitutional, and legal experts say that decision means the program must be reopened to first-time applicants. But the administration still isn't taking any new applications and now requires DACA recipients to reapply every year instead of every 2 years. Carla Daniela Salazar Chavira is an incoming freshman at Grand Canyon University. She was too young to apply before DACA was suspended in 2017.
I've always had to worry about the next day. It's part of being undocumented or documented or being in a mixed status family. Like, will I come home tomorrow and see my parents?
Chavira says she came to Tempe from Mexico when she was 8 months old, so Arizona is her home. A group of undocumented youth is challenging the effort to scale back DACA in a federal court in New York. Chavira says it's been an emotional roller coaster trying to keep track of the constant ways in which DACA is being undermined, on top of starting college during a pandemic.
I am your neighbor. I am a member of this community, whether you like to acknowledge me or not. I am here contributing because I want the city of Tempe, I want America to be as great as you wish it was.
Oscar Hernandez Ortiz is a DACA recipient and prospective law student who recently finished 2 years with Teach for America. He says DACA already had major barriers, including the cost of applying and reapplying, and the changes exacerbate them.
When the whole idea of an immigrant in the U.S. was to get opportunities, why is it that I am limited? How is it that my status, not anything about me, my status is the defining factor of who I can become?
Hernandez Ortiz says while he personally benefits greatly from DACA, it isn't enough. He hopes to see Congress pass legislation for a pathway to citizenship for the 11 million undocumented people in the U.S. For Public News Service, I'm Lily Bolke.
The head of the National Institutes of Health told Congress today that U.S. health officials will not skip or abbreviate any safety assessments in the development of a coronavirus vaccine. NIH Director Dr. Francis Collins said studying the safety and effectiveness of the COVID-19 vaccine candidates is now the agency's top priority, as Moderna, Pfizer, and AstraZeneca race to complete late-stage testing and submit approval applications to the Food and Drug Administration by the end of the year.
Please hear me now.
The rigor of the scientific evaluation of safety and efficacy will not be compromised. As a scientist, I'm excited that the pace of discovery is allowing us to respond to this crisis in record time. As a physician, I'm hopeful when I think of the millions of lives that have been saved from other diseases through vaccination.
An independent data and safety monitoring board is reviewing the integrity of the trials and continues to monitor ongoing results to ensure participants are safe. Collins told lawmakers the protocols for the trials are being overseen by the U.S. government, in contrast to traditional trials in which pharmaceutical companies are solely responsible for their design and implementation. The comments come as infectious disease experts and scientists have said they worry the vaccine approval process in the U.S. could be polluted by politics. President Trump, seeking re-election, has suggested a vaccine could be approved before Election Day on November 3rd. Meanwhile, AstraZeneca's vaccine trial has been paused after a participant in the United Kingdom fell ill. The pharmaceutical company said it will investigate whether the vaccine trial caused the volunteer's illness. Feature Story News' Nina Maria Potts reports.
The volunteer was taking part in the program run by Oxford University and AstraZeneca. The drug company says trials will be on hold until it's established whether the patient suffered a side effect from the vaccine. UK Health Secretary Matt Hancock says it's not necessarily bad news.
It is a normal part of a vaccine development that when you find a problem, then the system is paused whilst you investigate that particular problem. What it underlines is that we won't bring forward a vaccine unless it's safe.
From Feature Story News in Washington, I'm Nina Maria Potts.
As coronavirus cases rise across Europe, the British government today banned gatherings of more than 6 people in England and measures that could last through the rest of the year. Prime Minister Boris Johnson.
We're introducing the rule of 6. You must not meet socially in groups of more than 6, and if you do, you will be breaking the law. This will apply in any setting, indoors or outdoors, at home or in the pub.
British Health Secretary Matt Hancock said the new restriction bans large groups from meeting socially indoors and out. Doesn't apply to schools, workplaces, or weddings, funerals, and sports events that are deemed COVID secure. Hancock also said pubs and restaurants will be legally required to take the contact details of every customer for purposes of the government's test and trace program. The House Democratic Caucus held a roundtable discussion this week regarding the maternal disparities for African American and Latino women. Caucus members say the COVID-19 pandemic has made these disparities more obvious, although they existed for many years. KPFA's Daniel Whitty has the story.
African American women are 3 times more likely to die during pregnancy than white women. In addition, Black women are twice as likely to have an infant die from premature birth than white women. Advocates for Black maternal health say this disparity is rooted in environmental racism and racial bias in medicine. Catherine Flowers, the field organizer for Moms Clean Air Force, shares her experience at a hospital while giving birth to her child.
I experienced the disparities of our maternal health system when my water broke with my daughter prematurely. The hospital staff did not look like me, and no one believed me when I told them that my water had broken. The nurses on staff wanted to admit me to the psych ward instead of the labor and delivery floor. I remember it like yesterday. I had just come from City Hall regarding a meeting for the youth bill program, and they thought I had a mental health issue and would not believe me when I told them that I was in premature labor with my baby.
That's why Democratic lawmakers on the Black Maternal Health Caucus have introduced 9 bills they say will address a Black maternal health crisis in the country. They're calling the package Momnibus 2020 for short. The legislation would help train providers to screen for social determinants of health, such as environmental risks, and to address those risks. The Act also commissions a study on the impacts of climate change and pollution on maternal health. Congresswoman Lauren Underwood from Illinois is the author or co-sponsor of the 9 bills. She says new research shows that women of color are disproportionately impacted by climate change.
African Americans, Hispanic Americans, Native Americans, and other communities of color in the United States face heightened vulnerabilities for adverse health outcomes associated with climate change. In June, a new study published in JAMA added more evidence to illuminate these disparities. The study found that exacerbation of air pollution and heat exposure related to climate change may be significantly associated with risks to pregnancy outcomes, and the risks are disproportionately high for Black mothers. Racial disparities of maternal health outcomes have been a top priority for me as co-founder and co-chair of the Black Maternal Health Caucus. Just as the data on climate change clearly convey that we are facing a crisis, the statistics on maternal health outcomes demand attention and action as well.
The Momnibus legislation will also fund community-based organizations that help Black mothers diversify the perinatal workforce and provide post-maternal care. That could mean Medicaid coverage for 1 year after delivery. Climate Action Campaign Health Advisory Chair Dr. Bruce Bakar says that when the Journal of the American Medical Association published his group's work on June 18th, this became the first review of some of the common climate-related complications and outcomes. He says there are documented connections between heat, air pollutants such as ozone and fine particulate, and high rates of underweight and stillborn babies. Bakar gives examples of some of the risks and complications minority women suffer from.
Regarding these pregnancy outcomes, certainly stillbirth is an absolutely devastating event for any woman and her family. However, preemies and low birth weight babies, although often able to survive these days, frequently have significant respiratory and neurologic problems as children and face major health risks as adults. It's a really dangerous way to begin a life. One of our key findings, we found strong evidence of racial disparity among the studies. More than half of the studies noted worse outcomes for minority mothers, with Black moms called out more than twice as often as Latinas, the next highest risk group.
Bakar goes on to say that the government needs to take steps now to resolve the issue of climate change and that time is running out. One measure he says will help is reversing the rollback of air quality standards. For KPFA News, I'm Daniel Whitty.
Cloud cover tomorrow morning in the San Francisco Bay Area. Perhaps it will clear by the afternoon. Highs near 70 degrees around the bay. Further inland, it will be sunny with a high near 90 degrees. Sunny in the central San Joaquin Valley tomorrow with highs in the mid-90s in Los Angeles. Sunny with highs in the upper 80s. That's it for the news tonight for this Wednesday, September 9th. Thanks for joining us. I'm Mark Merkel. Good evening.
And this is a community announcement for September 2020. Help is always available on San Francisco Suicide Prevention's Crisis Hotline at 415-781-0500. The National Suicide Prevention Lifeline is 1-800-273-8255. For more information, visit sfsuicide.org or suicidepreventionlifeline.org. This COVID Coping Community Calendar is produced by the First Voice Apprenticeship Program. Please send your listing for consideration to KPFA at 1929 Martin Luther King Jr. Way, Berkeley 94704, or email calendar@kpfa.org. To hear this calendar again, call 510-848-6767 extension 621 or view it online at kpfa.org.